Hello everybody, and welcome to Theology 101. Welcome to our Friday series where we look at popular Bible verses that are often misquoted and misapplied. I hope that this series will help you understand the proper context of these verses so that you will know how to apply it to your lives. As the saying goes, a text without a context is a pretext for a proof text. In other words, if we fail to understand the context of a passage, then this can lead to a misapplication of that passage. Today we will be looking at Matthew chapter 18 verse 20. For where 2 or 3 are gathered in my name, there am I among them. This verse is often quoted when there is a gathering of Christians, whether they are gathering in a small group or at a Sunday service or at a Christian concert. This verse is used to say that no matter what the size of the gathering, that Jesus' presence is with us. But is that what the verse means? Let's jump in and find out. This verse comes up during a discourse Jesus has with his disciples, starting from Matthew chapter 16, verse 24. Within this discourse, his disciples interrupt him and ask him this question. At that time, the disciples came to Jesus saying, "Who is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven?" This question leads Jesus to teach about the importance of humility in his kingdom. Just as Jesus will humble himself to the point of death on the cross, and just as God the Father humbles himself in order to seek out his children, so too are his disciples to humble themselves in order to be great in God's kingdom. Then Jesus transitions from the topic of humility to forgiveness. The reason why is because they are closely related. A person cannot be humble unless he or she is willing to forgive others or to ask for forgiveness when they have wronged others. So Jesus lays out the proper steps his disciples must take if someone has sinned against them. He begins by presenting a hypothetical situation. If your brother sins against you, go and tell him his fault between you and him alone. If he listens to you, you have gained your brother. Jesus presents a case when a Christian has been wronged by another Christian, which is why he uses the phrase brother. The offended believer has a responsibility to go directly to that brother who sinned against him and talk with that person privately. Ideally, the two persons should resolve this conflict privately without getting other people involved. But what if the person who sinned against you is unwilling to admit his or her fault? This is where Jesus gives the next step. But if he does not listen, take 1 or 2 others along with you, that every charge may be established by the evidence of 2 or 3 witnesses. The next step is to involve at least 1 or 2 other people. But why would Jesus say this? Why complicate the matter by involving other people? It is because Jesus is referencing the Old Testament law. 1 witness is not enough to convict anyone accused of any crime or offense they may have committed. A matter must be established by the testimony of 2 or 3 witnesses. This principle is important for every Jew because they wanted to prevent false accusations before declaring a person guilty of a crime. The Apostle Paul tells Christians not to bring up an accusation against an elder unless they have it on the basis of 2 or 3 witnesses. In fact, this is the reason why we have 3 synoptic gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. If we only had one account, no Jewish person would take that account seriously because they knew that nothing should be considered true unless it's built on the basis of 2 or 3 witnesses. So this next step that Jesus talks about bringing 1 or 2 people with you, is referencing the Old Testament law back in Deuteronomy chapter 19. Verse 15. Now, Jesus is not talking about putting this person on trial, but by bringing other witnesses to the situation, they can then testify whether this person was willing to reconcile or not. But what happens if the person who sinned against you continues to resist any type of accountability? Jesus goes on to the next step. If he refuses to listen to them, tell it to the church. And if he refuses to listen even to the church, let him be to you as a Gentile and a tax collector. If step 2 fails, then step 3 says to bring it up to the church. Now, the word church does not refer to what we know as the church today. The Greek word for church is ekklesia and can refer to any type of gathering. This word was used to describe the Senate when they would gather to create laws, or it was used to describe an army when they would gather to fight a battle. In this context, Jesus is not talking about the new covenant community, which we call the church today, since the new covenant was ratified after Jesus resurrected from the dead. Instead, in this context, Jesus is talking about the gathering of his disciples. And Jesus wants his disciples to continue the principle given in the Old Testament law, which talks about excommunicating a person for unrepented sin. To treat a person as a Gentile or tax collector is to treat that person as an unbeliever, because those types of people during that time were typically not believers of God. Now, it might sound unreasonable to us to kick a person out of a gathering just because of some sin. But notice what Jesus adds. Truly I say to you, whatever you bind on earth shall be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth shall be loosed in heaven. The words bind and loose in this context means to forbid or to allow something. It might sound like that Jesus is saying that whatever the gathering decides to do to another person, God co-signs it. But that is not what Jesus is saying. The tense of these verbs is in the future perfect. This means that these future acts have been already established in the past. So it should be translated this way. Whatever you bind on earth will have already been bound in heaven. Jesus is saying that if the gathering follows the steps that he prescribes, then they will come to a decision that has already been established by God in heaven. In other words, they are fulfilling God's will and acting on his authority when they excommunicate a person after following these steps. And it is within this context where we come to our verse. Again, I say to you, if two of you agree on earth about anything they ask, it will be done for them by my Father in heaven. For where 2 or 3 gather in my name, there am I among them. Jesus restates the importance of having multiple witnesses when addressing a person's sin. Without it, you cannot make a case. But if multiple witnesses testify of a person's unrepented sin, then Jesus says that his presence is with them. In other words, they have his endorsement. What the disciples agree on earth regarding disciplinary matters of their gatherings may be taken as God's will if they follow these steps. So does this verse mean that Jesus' presence is with us no matter the size of our gatherings? Not quite. It is true that we have God's presence with us at all times because of the indwelling Holy Spirit. However, Jesus is not talking about that here. Instead, he is saying that if his disciples decide to excommunicate a person, they do so with God's authority if they follow the steps that Jesus laid out. If you want to learn more about this topic, I'll leave a link to a recommended book below in the description box. And if you missed the last video where I talked about whether we can do all things in Christ, I'll leave a link for you here to watch. Until next time, see you.